My hands were trembling, but it wasn't from nerves, not really. It was a buzzing electric excitement, the kind a mother feels on the day her world is about to change forever. I looked down at the silver-wrapped gift box resting on my lap. The paper, a shimmering, expensive sheet I'd picked out weeks ago, crinkled softly as I smoothed it for the 10th time. Inside, nestled on a bed of white satin, was my grandmother's pearl necklace. It wasn't a grand, flashy piece of jewelry, not like the diamonds you see in magazines. It was understated, classic, and it held the history of our family in its soft, milky glow. My grandmother, a woman whose strength I'd always admired, wore it when she married my grandfather after he returned from the war, his heart full of hope for a peaceful future. I had worn it 47 years ago when I married my Tom, feeling its familiar weight against my skin as I promised him forever. And for 28 years, every time I'd opened my jewelry box and seen it lying there, I had dreamed of this exact moment, the day I would pass it on to my own daughter, Jessica. Today was that day. Behind me, Tom, my husband, my rock, adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror. He caught my eye and gave me a slow, warm smile. He had the same proud, steady look on his face that he'd worn on the day Jessica graduated from college, a look that said, "We did it." "You look beautiful, Carol," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble that could still soothe any worry I had. I reached up and patted my hair, freshly styled in a way I rarely splurged on, and smoothed an imaginary wrinkle on my pale blue dress. I'd spent weeks searching for that dress, turning down dozens that were prettier or more fashionable. I wanted something quiet, something that would complement the wedding colors without drawing any attention. Today was not about me. It was all for her. Everything was for her. Every decision, every sacrifice for the last year had been for her. Tom had worked an extra 5 years past his planned retirement, getting up in the dark Ohio winters to head to a job his body was telling him to leave, all for this. For this day. For the Oakwood Manor, a venue that looked like it had been plucked from an English fairy tale, with its sprawling green lawns and a grand ballroom that sparkled under crystal chandeliers. It was Jessica's dream, and her dreams, as we were learning, came with a staggering price tag. $50,000. I still had trouble saying the number out loud. It was a figure Tom had withdrawn from his 401, the precious nest egg we had so carefully built over a lifetime of hard work, saving every extra dollar and foregoing vacations. "It's worth it," he'd said, seeing the worry etched on my face as he signed the papers. "To see our little girl have the happiest day of her life? It's worth every single penny." And we had believed it. With all our hearts we did. As Tom turned the car down the long, winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees, their branches forming a canopy above us, I let myself get lost in a flood of memories. I saw Jessica as a little girl, no older than 5, with scraped knees and bright blonde pigtails, presenting us with mud pies she'd made in the backyard as if they were gourmet creations. I saw her at 7, painstakingly tracing her hand on construction paper to make a turkey at Thanksgiving, her tongue sticking out in concentration, insisting we display it on the fridge until the paper turned yellow and fell apart. Where had that enthusiastic, loving little girl gone? When had she been replaced by this polished, distant woman who took days to return our calls and spoke to us with a polite coolness that felt more painful than any argument? I pushed the unsettling thought away. Weddings are stressful. She was just overwhelmed with all the planning. Today it would be different. Today, surrounded by all this beauty, a testament to how much we loved her, she would remember. The bond, the laughter, the family we had built. It would all come flooding back. The necklace in my hands wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a bridge to our past, a promise for our future. It was a symbol that was meant to say, "We are your family. We are your foundation. We will always be here for you." We had given everything to make this day a fairy tale for her. But what we were about to learn was that in this particular fairy tale, we were the villains, about to be brutally cast out of the kingdom we had built. The moment we stepped out of the car, the sheer scale of the event hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was even more opulent than I had imagined. White roses and pale blue hydrangeas, thousands upon thousands of them, were woven into breathtaking arches and draped over every available surface. A string quartet was warming up on a pristine lawn, their soft, elegant music drifting through the warm afternoon air. It was the picture of perfection, and it was all paid for. Every last petal, every single musical note. A young woman with a clipboard and a discreet earpiece hurried over to us, her smile bright and professional. "Mr. and Mrs. Gable? Carol and Tom?" she asked, her voice chirpy. "Yes, that's us," Tom replied, his chest puffing out just a fraction with a father's pride. He was so proud of what we were able to provide for our daughter. "Wonderful. Jessica asked me to bring you directly to the bridal suite as soon as you arrived," the coordinator said, leading us through a maze of manicured gardens and smiling guests. My heart began to pound with a happy, anxious rhythm. This was it. The moment a mother dreams of, the one you see in movies. I would see my beautiful daughter in her wedding dress, her face glowing. We'd share a few happy tears. I'd help her clasp the family necklace around her neck. And I'd tell her how much I loved her and how proud I was of the woman she'd become. The coordinator knocked softly on a heavy, ornate oak door with a little sign that read Bridal Suite. The door swung open and there she was. My daughter. And for a second I couldn't breathe. She was a vision, a queen from a storybook. But something was wrong. It wasn't the dress. It was a magnificent creation, but it wasn't the simple, elegant A-line gown she had joyfully picked out with me months ago. This was a mountain of shimmering satin and intricate crystal beadwork that must have cost a small fortune on its own. Her hair was swept up in a sophisticated style I'd never seen, and her makeup was worthy of a magazine cover. But it was her face that made the blood run cold in my veins. There was no joy. There was no warmth. Her eyes, the same brilliant blue eyes that I had stared into 1,000 sleepless nights when she was a colicky baby, were as cold and hard as chips of ice. She looked right past us, as if we were strangers who had wandered into the wrong room. "Mom. Dad," she said, her voice completely flat, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice she used for business calls. "What are you doing back here?" Tom, ever the gentle peacemaker, just frowned slightly. "Honey, the coordinator brought us. We just wanted to see you, to give you our gift before everything gets started." I held out the silver box, my hopeful smile feeling fragile and utterly fake on my face. "It's your great-grandmother's necklace," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The one you always loved." Jessica didn't even glance at it. Instead, she took a step forward into the hallway, pulling the heavy door almost completely shut behind her, physically shielding us from the view of her laughing bridesmaids inside. "Look," she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent hiss. "There's been a change of plans." Before we could even begin to ask what she meant, another woman appeared at her side, gliding out of the room like a hawk. It was Eleanor, Kevin's mother. A woman who prided herself on her family's old money and social standing. A woman who had been polite but coolly distant to us from the very beginning. She was dressed in a sleek pearl gray Chanel suit that probably cost more than our car. Eleanor looked at me, her eyes raking over my carefully chosen, perfectly appropriate blue dress, and a tiny condescending smile played on her perfectly painted lips. She leaned in and whispered to Jessica, but it was a stage whisper, meant for me to hear. "Jessica, darling, I told you. Their style. It's just not a fit here. It's a bit homespun." The insult was so blatant, so dripping with contempt, it felt like a physical slap. I saw Tom's jaw tighten, his hands clench into white-knuckled fists at his sides. My face burned with a humiliation so intense, so public, I thought I might actually be sick right there on the Persian runner. And then Jessica, my daughter, my only child, delivered the final killing blow. She looked at us, her parents, the two people on this earth who loved her more than life itself, and said the words that shattered my world into a million pieces. "Mom, Dad, you're not invited. This is my day, and Kevin and I want it to be perfect. Please just leave." We stood there, speechless, cast aside in the hallway of the fairy tale we had paid for. But they had made one fatal, catastrophic mistake. They forgot who held the checkbook. "Leave." The word hung in the air between us, ugly, sharp, and final. For a long moment my brain simply refused to process it. It was like a foreign language I couldn't comprehend. This had to be a joke. A cruel, terrible, wedding day jitters joke. I looked desperately at my daughter's face, searching for a flicker of humor, a hint of remorse, a sign that the loving child we raised was still in there somewhere. But there was nothing. Just a blank, impatient stare. She was waiting for us to vaporize, a minor, embarrassing inconvenience to be dealt with before her real, important life could begin. Tom finally found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse, broken croak. "Jessica, we're your parents. We paid for all of this." She actually shrugged. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement of her shoulders, but it was the most dismissive, disdainful gesture I had ever seen. It broke my heart all over again, grinding the shattered pieces into dust. "And I appreciate that," she said, the words as empty and lifeless as a dead leaf. "But this is what Kevin and I want. His family has certain expectations." She glanced over her shoulder at Eleanor, who was now watching us with an air of detached, clinical amusement, as if observing two unpleasant insects under a microscope. The unspoken message screamed at us from across the hallway. "You don't belong. You don't measure up. You are not good enough." The wedding coordinator, sensing the 5-alarm fire of a disaster unfolding, scurried over with a pained, strained smile plastered on her face. "Mr. and Mrs. Gable," she whispered, trying to guide us away with a gentle hand on my elbow. "If you'll just follow me, I can show you to a side exit. That way you won't have to disturb the other guests who are arriving." A side exit? Like we were criminals. Like we were trash being shuffled out the back door so as not to offend the sensibilities of the real guests. The humiliation was a physical thing. A hot, suffocating blanket that choked the air from my lungs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could see was the smug, triumphant look on Eleanor's face and the cold, empty stranger's eyes of my own child. I pulled my arm away from the coordinator's grasp. We were not going to be escorted out like naughty children. Tom took my hand, his grip firm and steadying, an anchor in my swirling sea of pain. He looked past Jessica, directly at the coordinator, and his voice was low and level, but it carried an authority that made the young woman flinch. "That won't be necessary," he said. "We know the way out." We turned side by side and walked away. We held our heads high, but every single step was an act of sheer will. Each step took us past another piece of our love and sacrifice. We walked past the string quartet we had hired, past the towering floral arrangements we had approved, past the endless rows of white chairs where strangers would soon sit to celebrate a wedding we were now barred from. In the car, the silence was a heavy, suffocating thing. I stared down at the silver-wrapped box still in my lap, the gift that had been rejected without so much as a glance. The tears I had been holding back since that hallway finally began to fall, hot and silent, tracing paths down my cheeks. Tom didn't start the engine. He just sat there, his large, capable hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were bone white. "She threw us away, Tom," I whispered to the windshield. "Like we were garbage." He turned to me then, and the raw pain in his eyes was a perfect mirror of my own. But as I watched, something else began to flicker to life deep within their blue depths. Something hard and resolute. The hurt was so deep, so absolute, that it had burned away all the sadness, leaving behind a cold, clear, diamond-hard anger. And I felt it in myself too. The tears stopped. The feeling that replaced them was something I hadn't felt in years. It was pure, unadulterated rage. I looked at my husband, the kindest, most decent man I'd ever known, and I knew he felt it too. I took a deep, shuddering breath. "Find a place with Wi-Fi, Tom," I said, my voice eerily steady. He didn't ask why. He just gave a single sharp nod, turned the key in the ignition, and pulled out of the parking lot of our daughter's perfect, beautiful $50,000 wedding. In 47 years of marriage, I had always been the peacemaker. But not today. Today I was done. If we weren't invited to the party, then there wasn't going to be a party. Tom found a small, nondescript coffee shop a few miles down the road, a place called The Daily Grind. It had a flickering neon free Wi-Fi sign in the window, and looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1990s. We walked in, two people dressed for the wedding of the year, and heads turned. We must have looked like aliens who had just landed. We found a small sticky table in the corner, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee and stale donuts. I placed the rejected gift box on the table between us, a silver tombstone marking the death of a dream. Then I pulled out my phone. Tom did the same. My hands were perfectly steady now. The trembling was gone, replaced by a chilling, absolute sense of purpose. In my email, I had a folder I'd meticulously organized over the past year. It was labeled simply, Jessica's Wedding. Inside was every contract, every invoice, every single piece of correspondence with every vendor. And on every single one of those legally binding documents was my name, Carol Gable, or my husband's, Tom Gable. We were the clients. We were the ones who had paid the hefty deposits. And we were the ones responsible for the final massive payments due at the end of the day. Which meant we were the only ones who could pull the plug. Tom looked at me, his face grim, a silent question in his eyes. He was giving me one last chance to back down, to be the peacemaker I'd always been. But I just looked back at him and gave a single sharp nod. Do it. He made the first call. His voice was calm, almost detached, like he was discussing a business transaction. Hello, this is Tom Gable. I'm calling regarding the Gable-Thompson wedding scheduled for today at the Oakwood Manor. Yes, that's the one. He paused, listening. I am the signatory on the contract for the venue. I am officially canceling the event, effective immediately. I could hear a faint, squawking, panicked voice on the other end of the line. Tom listened patiently for a moment, his face a mask of stone. I understand the timing is inconvenient, he said, his voice flat. But the cancellation is final. Do not proceed with the reception dinner. We will not be providing the final payment. He hung up. It was my turn. My finger hovered over the contact for the florist. I took a breath and pressed call. My speech was the same for each one. Hello, this is Carol Gable. I am the client of record for the Gable-Thompson wedding. I am canceling our contract, effective immediately. There was disbelief. There was confusion. There were protests. The catering manager, a man named Bob who I'd spoken with a dozen times, started yelling at me, his voice cracking with panic. Lady, I have food for 200 people here. Prime rib. It's all prepared. You can't do this. I didn't yell back. I just waited for him to finish. I understand your position, Bob, I said, my voice as cold and calm as a frozen lake. But the service has been canceled. Do not serve the food. We will not be paying the final balance. I called the bandleader next. Then the photographer. Click. Call. Cancel. Repeat. Took less than an hour. And then the storm we had unleashed began to hit our shores. Our phones, which had been silent, began to light up, one after the other. The first call was from the frantic wedding coordinator, her voice on the verge of tears. We ignored it. Then a text from a bridesmaid. What is happening? And then the calls from Jessica started. One after another, a relentless, desperate barrage. We didn't answer. We just let them pile up in our voicemail. Then the texts began to flood in, a digital tidal wave of her panic. The first one read, "What is going on? The band is packing up. Call me." We ignored it. A few minutes later, "Mom, why is the catering manager saying everything is canceled? This isn't funny. Call me now." Then, "Eleanor is going to have a heart attack. You're embarrassing me in front of everyone." And finally, the one that showed she still didn't understand a single thing. "What did you do?" We sat there in that dingy coffee shop, sipping our now cold coffee, and quietly, methodically, we dismantled her perfect day. She wanted us to be invisible. Fine. We would disappear. And we would take her entire $50,000 fairy tale with us. If you think we did the right thing, please hit that like button and let us know. Because what happened next was even crazier. We had just started our work, but back at the wedding venue, a toxic lie was already being spun. A lie designed to ruin our name completely. The drive home from the coffee shop was the longest, quietest drive of my life. The adrenaline from making those calls had worn off, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion that settled deep in my bones. We didn't talk. What was there to say? We had just dropped a nuclear bomb on our daughter's life, and now we were driving through the fallout. The phone, which I'd finally put on silent, buzzed relentlessly in the cup holder, a constant angry reminder of the chaos we had unleashed. I stared out the window at the passing Ohio landscape, but I didn't see it. My mind was replaying not just the horrifying events of the day, but the countless little moments over the years that had led us here. It was like watching a movie of our lives, but this time, all the scenes I'd once viewed through the soft lens of a mother's love were now sharp, ugly, and clear. All the little red flags I had ignored for years were now giant, waving banners of warning. I remembered her 16th birthday with painful clarity. We had saved for a year, putting aside a little from every paycheck, to buy her first car. It wasn't a flashy new convertible, but it was a safe, low-mileage Honda that we knew would be reliable. She didn't even crack a smile when we showed it to her. She just grabbed the keys, and as she walked away, she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for me to hear. I didn't ask for a used one. At the time, Tom had just sighed and laughed it off. Teenagers, he'd said with a weary shrug, as if ingratitude was a normal phase of development. Then there was college. We co-signed her student loans, paid her rent for the first year so she could focus on her studies, and sent care packages filled with homemade cookies and her favorite snacks. She only ever called when she needed something. More money for books, help with a deposit on a new apartment, advice on how to deal with a difficult roommate. The calls never started with, "How are you?" They always started with, "I need." We had become human ATMs, dispensers of funds and favors, and we had foolishly allowed it to happen. We had enabled this toxic pattern for years, all under the misguided belief that we were just being supportive, loving parents. The wedding wasn't the sickness. It was just the final, ugliest symptom of a disease that had been festering for a long, long time. We pulled into our driveway just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that felt like a cruel joke. The house was quiet. Too quiet. As I walked through the front door, my phone began to ring again. I glanced at the screen and saw it was my younger sister, Patty. A wave of relief washed over me. Finally, a friendly voice, a sympathetic ear. I answered, desperate to unburden myself. But the voice that greeted me was not sympathetic. It was cold and sharp with accusation. "Carol, I cannot believe you," Patty said, her voice practically vibrating with anger. "Jessica just called me from the wedding, completely hysterical. How could you get drunk and cause a scene at your own daughter's wedding? Just because you don't approve of her new mother-in-law? You've humiliated this entire family." I froze in the entryway, the phone pressed hard against my ear. The world tilted on its axis. Drunk? Caused a scene? The words were so absurd, so far from reality, that it took me a moment to even process them. "Patty, what on earth are you talking about? We didn't have a single drink. We were asked to leave." "Oh, don't you lie to me, Carol," she snapped, her voice full of self-righteous fury. "Jessica told me everything. How you made a spectacle of yourself, how you screamed at Eleanor in front of her bridesmaids, and how poor Tom had to practically drag you out of there before you ruined the whole ceremony. And then to top it all off, you canceled everything out of spite. Pure childish spite." The cruelty of the lie stole the breath from my lungs. It wasn't enough for Jessica to throw us out. It wasn't enough to humiliate us. She had to poison our own family against us too. She had to twist the narrative, painting us as the villains, as unhinged drunken monsters, to justify her own monstrous behavior. She wasn't just ungrateful, she was malicious. She was actively trying to destroy our reputation. I tried to explain what had really happened, my voice shaking with a fresh wave of rage and disbelief. I told Patty about the cold dismissal, about Eleanor's cutting remark, about being told point-blank that we were not invited. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When Patty finally spoke, her voice was full of doubt. "Well, she didn't mention that part." I hung up the phone, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. My own sister had believed the lie before she'd even heard my side of the story. That's how convincing Jessica could be when she was playing the victim. She didn't just erase us from her wedding. She was trying to erase us from our own family. And it was in that moment that I knew this was no longer just about a ruined wedding. This was a fight for our dignity, for our truth. And it was a fight we absolutely had to win. A few days of suffocating, agonizing silence passed. We didn't hear from Jessica, and after my devastating conversation with Patty, I didn't have the strength to reach out to any other family members. We were on an island of our own making, just the two of us, adrift in a sea of hurt. The initial hot rage had cooled into a constant, dull ache of betrayal. To escape the oppressive quiet of the house, where every room held a memory of the daughter we thought we had, we decided to drive up to our small rustic family cabin on Lake Erie. It had always been our sanctuary, a simple place of peace with no phone service to bother us. We needed that now more than ever. The air by the lake was crisp and clean, and for a little while, as we watched the sun set over the water, we could almost pretend that our world hadn't been completely turned upside down. On the second day, I drove into the small town nearby, a place called Port Clinton, to pick up some groceries and a newspaper. The town was the kind of place where everyone knows everyone's business, a fact that I was about to become very grateful for. As I was in the checkout line at the small, family-owned grocery store, a familiar voice called out my name. Carol Gable. I thought that was you. It was Howard Miller, an old friend whose family had owned a cabin down the road from ours for as long as I could remember. We made the usual small talk, the weather, the fishing, how the town was changing. Then, leaning in conspiratorially, he said something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up straight. Say, Carol, he said, his voice a low whisper. I heard your new son-in-law, that Kevin fella, works at that big financial firm in Cleveland, right? I ran into a buddy of mine from college who's on their compliance team. Real shame about that whole business with Kevin. Never good to see a young man get mixed up in that sort of thing. I focused on keeping my face a perfect mask of polite neutrality, but inside my heart started to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. I'm sorry, Howard, I'm not sure I know what you mean, I said, my voice amazingly calm. Howard looked confused, then embarrassed, as if he'd spoken out of turn. Oh, well, the trouble with the client accounts. I just assumed you knew. My friend said it was a real mess. Said they had to let him go about 3 months back. It was all very hush-hush. Something about improper handling of client funds. I felt a dizzying wave of cold wash over me, and I had to grip the edge of the counter to steady myself. 3 months ago, Jessica had just been on the phone with me last week, gushing about a huge promotion Kevin was supposedly in line for, using it as a reason why they needed an even more extravagant honeymoon. She had lied. A huge calculated lie. Or she herself had been lied to. I didn't know which was worse. I mumbled my goodbyes to Howard and hurried out of the store, my mind racing a mile a minute. That night, back at the cabin, I sat with my laptop, tethering it to my phone's weak signal. I started digging. I wasn't a private investigator, but I was a mother with a broken heart and a burning need for the truth. I searched for Kevin's name, the name of his firm. His LinkedIn profile was a polished monument to success, still listing him as a senior financial analyst. His Instagram was a carefully curated gallery of a life we had apparently been funding: golf outings at exclusive country clubs, expensive dinners, a new Rolex watch. But then I started searching for news articles about the firm itself, and finally found it. A small buried press release from 3 months ago, announcing an internal restructuring and reinforcement of compliance protocols following a routine audit. No names were mentioned, but the timing was a perfect match. Then, with a feeling of dread, I searched for his parents, James and Eleanor Thompson, the picture of old money, untouchable wealth. I went to the county auditor's website and looked up the public property records for their grand, sprawling home in Westlake. And there it was, in black and white. The house had been refinanced 3 separate times in the last 5 years. The most recent mortgage for a huge amount was taken out just 6 months ago. And then I found the final damning piece of the puzzle, a notice of default from 8 months prior. It had apparently been resolved, but the message was as clear as a siren in the night. The Thompsons weren't just wealthy. They were desperate. They were house poor and drowning in debt. The pieces all clicked into place with a sickening final thud. The sudden need for a lavish wedding. The pressure for us to pay for everything up front. The more expensive dress. The cruel dismissal of us, the unstylish parents who might ask too many questions. This wasn't about social climbing. This was a financial rescue mission. A desperate, calculated fraud to maintain an illusion of wealth. The wedding wasn't a celebration of love. It was a stage, a performance. And we were the unwitting and now very unwilling financiers. The only question left was the most painful one of all. How much did my daughter know about all of this? Was she a co-conspirator? Or was she just another one of their victims? Returning home from the quiet solitude of the lake, the sadness that had clung to me like a damp fog was gone. It had been burned away by the harsh, clarifying light of the truth. We had been played. We had been treated like fools, not just by our daughter in a moment of bridal selfishness, but by an entire family of grifters who had seen us as nothing more than a solution to their financial problems. The pain of the betrayal was still there, a deep, tender bruise on my soul, but now it was sharpened by the sting of a calculated, long-term deception. We were no longer just hurt parents. We were victims of a deliberate financial and emotional scheme. And we were absolutely done being victims. The very first call I made on Monday morning was not to Jessica, or to my sister Patty, but to a lawyer my trusted friend had recommended. Her name was Miss Davies, and she was a sharp, impeccably dressed, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who radiated competence. We sat in her quiet professional office, the air smelling of old books and fresh coffee, and for an hour we laid out the whole sordid story. We told her everything, from Tom's $50,000 401 withdrawal to the cruel lie about me being drunk at the wedding. We showed her the folder of invoices, the legally binding contracts with our names on them, and the printouts of the property records and news articles I had found. She listened without interruption, her intelligent eyes missing nothing, her expression unreadable. When we were finally finished, the whole ugly story hanging in the air between us, she didn't offer us tissues or platitudes. She offered us a plan. "You are not overreacting," she said, her voice firm and clear, cutting through my fog of guilt and confusion. "You are protecting yourselves from further financial and emotional abuse. That is not a spiteful act. It is a responsible one." The word abuse hit me like a ton of bricks. I had never allowed myself to think of it that way. I'd thought of it as disrespect, as selfishness, as a terrible lack of gratitude. But she was right. Being systematically lied to, manipulated for money, and then publicly humiliated and slandered to our own family, that was abuse. For the next week, our lives became a whirlwind of meetings. We worked closely with Ms. Davies and a new financial planner she recommended, a kind but firm man named Mr. Chan. It felt like we were building a fortress around the life we had worked so hard for, brick by legal brick. On their advice, we established an irrevocable trust, a complex legal structure that would shield our assets from any future attempts at manipulation. We rewrote our wills. This was the hardest part. We removed Jessica as the sole, automatic beneficiary. Instead, Ms. Davies helped us set up a new arrangement, a structured inheritance with strict conditions, to be managed by a neutral third party, ensuring that our life savings would not be squandered or fall into the wrong hands. We closed any old joint accounts we might have overlooked from when she was younger and put new two-factor security protocols on everything. It felt surreal, almost clinical, to be taking these drastic steps against our own child. But with every document we signed, I felt a heavy layer of anxiety and fear peel away. We were taking back control. We were no longer helpless. During that same week, I made another call, one that was just for me. I called a therapist. For 28 years, my identity had been completely wrapped up in being Jessica's mom. I had been so focused on her needs, her wants, her happiness, that I had completely lost track of myself. In my very first session, the therapist asked me a simple question that left me speechless. "Carol," she said gently, "apart from being a mother to Jessica and a wife to Tom, who are you?" I just stared at her, my mind a complete blank. I had no idea. "Well," she said with a kind, encouraging smile, "let's find out together." It was the beginning of another, more personal journey of rebuilding. Not just my finances, but my very sense of self. We were building our fortress brick by brick, both legally and emotionally. We were securing our future. And just as the last brick was being set in place, the enemy appeared at the gate, not with a white flag of surrender, but with another Trojan horse, another demand disguised as an invitation. We were fortifying ourselves, and soon Jessica and Kevin would discover that they weren't just knocking on the door anymore. They were about to hit a solid brick wall. About a week after our final meeting with the lawyer, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived in our mailbox. There was no stamp. It had been hand-delivered and left leaning against the door. My stomach immediately tightened into a cold, not as I recognized Jessica's elegant, looping handwriting on the front. With a sense of dread, I opened it. Inside was a formal, engraved invitation to a reconciliation dinner at the Grand Steer, the most obscenely expensive steakhouse in Cleveland. It was a place for corporate power brokers and anniversary celebrations, not a place for a raw, honest family conversation. Tucked inside was a small, handwritten note on matching stationery. "Please come. We need to talk. We can fix this. Love, Jessica." Love, Jessica. I said the words out loud in my empty kitchen, and they tasted like ash in my mouth. Tom came in from the garage, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He read the invitation over my shoulder and let out a short, harsh laugh. "A reconciliation dinner? You've got to be kidding me. This isn't an apology, Carol. This is a performance. They want to get us in public at a fancy restaurant, where we'll be too embarrassed to say what really needs to be said." It's a trap. He was absolutely right. It was another calculated manipulation, another attempt to control the narrative and the environment. We were supposed to show up, play the part of the happy, forgiving family for the benefit of the other diners, and then quietly agree to whatever financial bailout they were about to ask for. I took the expensive invitation and slid it into the new legal folder Ms. Davies had given us, the one labeled simply, documentation. Then I shoved the folder into a drawer. We were not going to be actors in their next play. A few days later my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but my gut told me to answer. Carol? It's Kevin. His voice was as smooth as silk, oozing a practiced charm that now made my skin crawl. I hope you and Tom are doing well. We were so disappointed you couldn't make it to dinner the other night. I refused to play his game. We weren't available, Kevin. There was a short pause on his end, the first crack in his polished facade. Well, he continued, quickly recovering, we really think it's important to clear the air about the wedding. There seems to have been some miscommunication. That word again. Miscommunication. As if the words, "You're not invited, please leave," could possibly be misinterpreted. There was no miscommunication, Kevin, I said, my voice as cold and hard as the January ice on Lake Erie. The message you and Jessica delivered was perfectly clear. The fake charm in his voice completely evaporated, replaced by a harder, more insistent edge. Look, Carol, I understand you're upset. Things got emotional. But Jessica is devastated. She's your only daughter. Don't you think you owe her the chance to make things right? Owe her? The sheer, unmitigated arrogance of that statement was breathtaking. After everything they had done, after the lies, the theft, the humiliation, he had the nerve to suggest that we owed them something? A fire I didn't even know I possessed surged through my veins. Let me be very clear, Kevin, I said, my voice low and dangerously quiet. I don't owe Jessica a thing right now. And I most certainly do not owe you an explanation. I know you were fired from your job 3 months ago for mishandling client funds. I know your family is drowning in debt. And I know this entire wedding was a fraudulent sham from start to finish. So don't you ever dare to talk to me about what I owe. Do not contact us again. I hung up the phone before he could respond, my hand shaking, not with fear or weakness, but with a thrilling, empowering rage. I know many of you watching right now might be thinking I was being too harsh, that I should have heard them out, that family is family. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in my shoes. But I promise you, keep watching. Because you're about to find out the real terrifying reason Kevin was so desperate to get his hands on our money. It was so much worse than we could have ever imagined. The phone call with Kevin was a turning point. It was the first time I had stood up to their manipulation, the first time I had used the truth as a shield and a weapon. The fortress we had built was holding strong. He had tried to breach the walls with his slick words and guilt trips, and he had failed spectacularly. For a few weeks after that call, there was a blessed, deafening silence. No calls, no texts, no more hand-delivered envelopes appearing on our doorstep. Tom and I started to breathe again, to unclench muscles we didn't even know we'd been holding tight for months. We went for long walks in the park, I spent hours in my garden, coaxing my roses back to life, and Tom finally finished restoring the old Triumph motorcycle that had been gathering dust in the garage for the better part of a decade. We were slowly, cautiously reclaiming our lives from the wreckage. We were discovering who Carol and Tom were, not just Jessica's parents. But the piece was a fragile, thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark lake, and it was about to be shattered. One Tuesday morning I was in the kitchen, enjoying a second cup of coffee and reading the newspaper, when the phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize with a strange area code, but for some reason, an icy finger of dread traced its way down my spine. Something told me I had to answer it. Hello, I said. A man's voice, rough and impatient and full of a gravelly menace, was on the other end. Is Tom Gable there? He grunted, not so much asking as demanding. He's not available at the moment. May I take a message? I said, my voice maintaining a polite, steady tone that I did not feel. There was a pause on the other end, and then a low, menacing chuckle that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Yeah, lady, you can take a message. You tell your husband that his son-in-law, the pretty boy Kevin, is a deadbeat. He owes my associates $25,000. And the interest on that is piling up real fast. We know where you live. And we know where your pretty little daughter lives in that fancy condo. You tell Tom to get us our money. Soon. The line went dead. I stood frozen in my sunny kitchen, the phone still pressed to my ear, a terrifying, paralyzing cold seeping into my very bones. This wasn't about credit card debt. This wasn't a missed mortgage payment. This was something dark and dangerous. Kevin hadn't just been irresponsible. He had gotten involved with loan sharks. He had brought a violent criminal element into our lives. The $50,000 we had lost on the wedding suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the hole this man had dug. He hadn't just embarrassed our daughter. He had put her and us in physical danger. I was still standing there trying to process the threat, trying to make my limbs work when the doorbell rang. It wasn't a polite chime. It was a sharp, frantic, repeated ringing that made me jump out of my skin. I crept to the front door and looked through the peephole, my heart pounding against my ribs like a drum. It was Jessica. But it was a version of her I had never seen before. A version that will be seared into my memory until the day I die. The polished, perfect, arrogant queen from the wedding was gone. In her place stood a ghost. Her blonde hair, always so perfectly styled, was unwashed and matted. Her expensive clothes were rumpled and stained, as if she'd slept in them. And her face was pale, gaunt, and tear-streaked. Her eyes, when she looked up and saw my shadow through the glass, were wide with a terror so profound, so absolute, that it made my own fear seem small. I fumbled with the lock and opened the door. She didn't say a word. She just fell forward into my arms, her body trembling with violent, uncontrollable sobs. "Mom!" she choked out, her voice breaking on the single desperate syllable. It wasn't the voice of the cold woman from the wedding. It was the voice of the little girl who used to run to me with scraped knees and nightmares, believing I could fix anything. I pulled her inside, my anger and resentment momentarily forgotten, completely eclipsed by the primal, overwhelming instinct of a mother to protect her child from a threat she couldn't yet understand. She clung to me, her manicured fingers digging into the flesh of my arms. She looked at me, her eyes wild with panic, and uttered the words that confirmed my worst fears, the words that meant our nightmare was only just beginning. "Mom, Kevin's gone. He took everything. And there are bad men looking for me." I half-carried, half-dragged Jessica to the living room couch, the same floral couch she used to build elaborate forts on when she was a little girl. She collapsed onto the cushions like a broken doll whose strings had been cut. I sat beside her, my own fear a cold, hard knot in my stomach, and waited for the wrenching sobs to subside enough for her to speak. The whole ugly story came out in a torrent of tears, hiccups, and fragmented, panic sentences. Kevin had disappeared 2 days ago. She had woken up to find his side of the closet completely empty, his car gone from the garage, and their joint bank account, which she thought held at least a few $1,000s, completely drained to a balance of zero. He had left a note on the kitchen counter. A short, cowardly note that said he was in over his head and needed a fresh start somewhere else. The house of cards he had built had finally come tumbling down, and it was burying her in the rubble. The bank had called that morning about 2 missed mortgage payments on the condo she thought was almost paid off. It turned out Kevin had secretly taken out a second mortgage on it months ago, forging her signature, and had squandered all the money. Then came the credit card statements she found stuffed in his desk drawer, statements he had been hiding from her. They were all maxed out, tens of thousands of dollars in debt for the golf club memberships, the fancy dinners, the designer clothes, the entire lifestyle of lies. He had been living a complete fantasy, funding it all with a mountain of debt that was now legally half hers. And then she told me about the loan. The $25,000 from some shady private lender that he had used to buy her enormous engagement ring and pay for their lavish honeymoon in Bali. The private lender who had started making threatening phone calls, the same man who had called me just an hour before. She was in a complete free fall, her perfect life revealed as a hollow, dangerous sham. She had nowhere else to go. After she had sobbed out the entire story, she looked at me, her eyes red and swollen, and for a moment, a flicker of the old, entitled, blame-shifting Jessica returned. "He called you, didn't he?" she said, her voice turning sharp and accusatory. "He asked you for money last week. If you had just given it to him, none of this would be happening. You could have fixed this. Why didn't you help us?" The blame, the sheer, unmitigated gall of it, even now was like a splash of ice water to my face. I took a deep breath, the motherly panic receding, pushed back by that hard-won clarity I had fought so desperately to find. "No, Jessica," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "Money would not have fixed this. Money is the one thing that has never fixed anything for you. For your entire life it has only ever enabled you. It has been a bandage on a broken bone." She stared at me, her mouth open in disbelief, as if I were speaking a foreign language. "The problem," I continued, looking her straight in the eye, forcing her to see the truth, "is not that Kevin is a liar and a thief, although he is both of those things. The real problem is that you chose him. You chose the illusion. You chose the big house and the fancy parties and the approval of people like Eleanor. And you were so desperate to have that life that you were willing to throw away the only two people on this entire planet who ever truly unconditionally loved you. You didn't just throw us out of your wedding, honey. You threw us out of your life because you were ashamed of us. Weren't you?" The question hung in the air between us, raw and unavoidable. The accusation in her eyes finally dissolved, washed away by a powerful wave of raw, gut-wrenching shame. She looked down at her trembling hands, unable to meet my gaze. She gave a single miserable nod. And then she finally completely broke. The anger, the blame, the entitlement. It all washed away, leaving only the ugly, unvarnished truth. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words choked with the kind of sobs that come from the deepest part of the soul. "I'm so sorry, Mom. You're right. I was ashamed. And I was so stupid." The apology, the real one, was finally here. But the words, however sincere, couldn't erase the deep scars. The question now was, what do we do next? Can a relationship that has been so thoroughly shattered ever truly be put back together again? I picked up the phone and called Tom at his workshop. I didn't explain. I just said 2 words. "Come home." He must have heard the urgency in my voice, because he was walking through the back door less than 15 minutes later, his face etched with concern. When he saw Jessica, broken and crying on our living room couch, the anger that had been simmering in him for months warred with a lifetime of fatherly love and concern. He didn't say a word at first, just stood there taking in the scene, his jaw tight. Then he went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and handed it to her. We sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where we had helped her with her second-grade homework and celebrated every birthday with a homemade cake. And for the first time in her adult life, we talked to her not as parents who would coddle and protect her, but as 2 adults dealing with a serious, life-altering crisis. We made one thing crystal clear from the very beginning. We were not a blank check. The days of us being her personal emergency fund were over. We would help her, but it would be on our terms, and it would be a hand up, not a handout. "This is not a rescue, Jessica," Tom said, his voice firm but not unkind. His hands were resting on the table, steady and sure. "This is a reset. This is your chance to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet. We will provide the support, but you and only you have to do the work." We laid out the conditions. They were not negotiable. First, regarding the immediate threat of the loan sharks. We told her we would have our lawyer, Ms. Davies, contact them immediately. From this moment on, all communication would go through her. However, in return, Jessica had to go to the police and file a formal, detailed report against Kevin for fraud, forgery, and theft. She had to take legal action against the man who had done this to her. There would be no more hiding, no more shame, no more protecting his name. She had to face it head-on. Second, her living and financial situation. She could stay with us in her old bedroom, but it was not a permanent arrangement. We gave her a strict deadline, 3 months. In that time, her number 1 priority was to find a job. Any stable job with a steady paycheck. We would not give her spending money. She would live under our roof, eat our food, but she had to start the process of providing for herself immediately. Third, and for me this was the most important condition of all. She had to get help. Real help. We required her to sign up for financial counseling to learn how to manage a budget, how to deal with the mountain of debt that was now legally half hers, and how to rebuild her credit from scratch. And she had to agree to attend regular family therapy sessions with me. "We are not going to just forget this happened, Jessica," I told her, looking her straight in the eye. "We are not sweeping this under the rug and pretending to be a happy family. We have to talk about the years of hurt, the disrespect, the reasons why we got to this terrible place. If our relationship is going to have any chance of surviving, It has to be rebuilt from the ground up on a foundation of pure, brutal honesty. She sat there, listening to our terms, her face pale, the tears having finally dried. This was not the easy fix she had likely come here hoping for. We were not just writing a check and making the scary men and the big bills go away. We were demanding she fundamentally change her entire way of life. We were demanding that she finally, at 28 years old, grow up. For a long silent moment, she just stared at the worn wood of the kitchen table. I held my breath, my heart pounding, wondering if her deeply ingrained pride would make her get up and walk out the door. Then she took a deep, shaky breath and looked up, first at Tom, then at me. "Okay," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Okay, I'll do it. I'll do whatever you say." Jessica had agreed to our terms, but I could see the sheer terror and uncertainty in her eyes. Was she really capable of this monumental task? Or was this just another empty promise born of desperation that would evaporate as soon as the immediate crisis passed? Only time would tell. The first few weeks were painfully awkward. Jessica moved through our house like a ghost, quiet and timid, always careful to clean up after herself, to not take up too much space. She was a guest in the home where she had once ruled as a beloved princess. The quiet, predictable rhythm of our retired life was completely disrupted. Tom and I found ourselves whispering in the evenings, as if we didn't want to disturb her. I had to constantly, consciously fight the urge to fall back into my old habits, the habits of a lifetime. I'd start to cook her favorite meal for dinner out of pure instinct, then stop myself and make something simple that Tom and I both liked. I'd see her clothes left on a chair and my hands would itch to pick them up and do her laundry for her. My therapist's voice was a constant, gentle reminder in my head. She is not a child, Carol. When you treat her like one, you are sending the message that you don't believe she is capable of being a responsible adult. But Jessica, to her immense credit, started to do the work. The very next day after that terrible confrontation, she was on the old desktop computer in the guest room, her old room, updating her resume. She spent hours every day searching for jobs, making calls, sending out applications. Within 2 weeks, she had an interview. A week after that, she got a job offer. It wasn't a glamorous position at a high-powered downtown marketing firm. It was an entry-level job at a small local insurance company, doing their social media. The salary was modest, barely enough to live on. But it was a start. It was a steady paycheck. She came home that day and showed us the official offer letter, her hand trembling slightly, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I saw a flicker of genuine, hard-earned pride in her eyes. She kept her other promises, too. She went to the police station with our lawyer, Ms. Davies, and filed a detailed report against Kevin. It was a grueling, humiliating, multi-hour experience, she told me later, but she did it. Ms. Davies took over all communication with the loan sharks, and the threatening calls, to my immense relief, stopped. The financial counseling sessions were, by her own account, brutal. She was forced to confront the stark reality of her situation. The ruined credit score, the staggering amount of debt that was now her sole responsibility. Her counselor helped her create a strict, detailed budget for the first time in her life, forcing her to learn the critical difference between a want and a need. The therapy sessions with me were the hardest part for both of us. The first few were tense and filled with tears and angry, recycled accusations. But our therapist, a wonderfully patient woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, guided us expertly through the minefield of our shared history. We talked about the wedding. We talked about her deep-seated feelings of shame and inadequacy that had driven her to make such terrible choices. And we talked about my feelings of being used, taken for granted, and ultimately discarded. It was raw, uncomfortable, and emotionally draining. But for the very first time, we were being truly painfully honest with each other. As the 3-month deadline we had set loomed, Jessica came to us one evening after dinner. She announced that she had found an apartment she could afford. It was a tiny one-bedroom in a nondescript building on the other side of town, miles away from the trendy neighborhood she had lived in with Kevin. The following weekend, Tom and I helped her move. We carried worn-out boxes and assembled cheap, flat-pack furniture from Target. As we stood in the middle of her small, sparse living room, she looked around, a nervous but determined smile on her face. "It's not much," she said quietly, more to herself than to us. "But it's mine. I can afford it. All by myself." And in that moment, hearing the quiet, resilient strength in her voice, I felt a flicker of hope. A real genuine hope that the daughter I had lost was finally starting to find her way home. Watching her stand in her own small apartment, a space she had earned through her own hard work, I saw a glimpse of the strong, independent woman she could become. But the biggest test was still yet to come. Our first Thanksgiving, the first major family holiday since the storm had broken. Would we be able to find our way back to being a real family again? As Thanksgiving approached, a familiar sense of dread began to creep into the corners of my mind. The holiday had always been a massive affair in our family, a boisterous gathering filled with traditions, laughter, and mountains of food. This year, the thought of it just made me feel tired. The idea of trying to pretend everything was normal, of putting on a happy face, felt like an impossible lie. Tom and I talked it over one evening on the back porch. We decided we would invite Jessica for dinner, but it had to be different. We would create new, healthier boundaries. Just for the afternoon, not the entire long weekend. A simple, quiet meal, without the pressure of extended family and old expectations. When I called her to extend the quiet invitation, however, she surprised me completely. There was a long pause on her end of the line. "Actually, Mom," she said, her voice hesitant and small, a voice I hadn't heard since she was a teenager. "I was wondering, and it's okay if you say no, but I was wondering if maybe I could host this year? My place. I know it's small and it won't be anything fancy, but I'd really like to try." I was so stunned I was momentarily speechless. Jessica had never cooked a holiday meal in her entire life. She was the one who always showed up late with a bottle of store-bought wine. I've been taking a cooking class at the community college," she admitted, her voice full of a sheepish pride. "It's part of my self-improvement plan. Learning to do things for myself instead of always expecting someone else to do them for me." I felt a swell of emotion so strong and sudden it caught me off guard. A powerful mix of shock and overwhelming pride. "We would love that, honey," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. "That sounds wonderful. What can we bring?" "Just yourselves," she replied quickly. "Please. I really want to do this for you and Dad." On Thanksgiving Day, Tom and I drove to her apartment, carrying a single bottle of wine and a small bouquet of fall flowers, but otherwise empty-handed as she had requested. Her tiny apartment was spotless. She had decorated with a few simple, festive arrangements, and the small dining table was carefully set with mismatched dishes and silverware she'd clearly found at a thrift store. It was charming, and it was all her. "Welcome," she said, greeting us at the door with a nervous but genuinely happy smile. The whole apartment smelled delicious. The meal wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. The turkey was a little on the dry side. The gravy had a few lumps. The pumpkin pie had a giant crack down the middle. But it was, without a doubt, the best Thanksgiving dinner I have ever had. Because my daughter had made all of it from scratch, completely on her own. She had planned a menu, created a budget, shopped for the ingredients, and cooked for 2 solid days. It was a profound act of love, but it was more than that. It was an act of fundamental, transformative change. "This is delicious, Jess," Tom said, taking a second helping of mashed potatoes, and I could tell he meant it with all his heart. After dinner, as we sat with our coffee and the imperfectly perfect pie, Jessica reached into a drawer in her small sideboard and pulled out a small handmade card. She slid it across the table to me. On the front, she had carefully pressed and glued a single vibrant flower from the community garden where I had started volunteering. My heart ached. She had been paying attention. I opened it. Inside, in her familiar, elegant script, she had written, "Mom, thank you for not rescuing me when what I really needed was to learn how to save myself. There are no words to say how sorry I am for the pain I caused you and Dad. I am working every single day to become someone worthy of the love you've always given me, even when I didn't deserve it. I love you, Jessica." The tears I had been holding back for so long finally came. But this time they weren't tears of pain or anger. They were tears of relief. Tears of gratitude. Tears of hope. I looked across the small table at my daughter, really looked at her, and I saw not the ice queen from the wedding, but a young woman who was fighting her way back to herself, back to us. "Thank you," I whispered, reaching for her hand. "This is the greatest gift you could have ever given me." It was a huge, monumental step forward, but I knew our journey was far from over. Our relationship was like an old, beloved house that had been damaged in a storm. We were rebuilding it one brick at a time. And we had just laid the first most important one. That Thanksgiving was a turning point. It didn't magically erase the past or heal all the wounds, but it opened the door to a different kind of future for our family, one built on honesty instead of expectations. Our relationship with Jessica continued to evolve slowly, carefully, and with a great deal of intention from all of us. We started having dinner together once a month. The conversations were different now. She would ask about our lives with genuine interest, about Tom's motorcycle project, about my volunteer work at the community garden. And she would share her own struggles and small victories, the challenges of sticking to her strict budget, the pride she felt after negotiating a small raise at work, the funny story about her eccentric neighbor. There was no more pretense, no more illusion. Just the simple, sometimes awkward truth. I was no longer just her mother, the fixer of all problems. I was Carol, a woman with her own interests and passions. Tom was no longer just her father, the endless provider. He was Tom, a man who was rediscovering his own hobbies. We were becoming individuals again with our own lives, our own friends, our own dreams. The following spring, Tom and I finally took that cross-country road trip we had postponed for her wedding. For 6 glorious weeks, we drove through the vast, beautiful landscapes of our country. We saw the Grand Canyon, the towering forests of the Pacific Northwest, and the rocky coast of Maine. We stayed in cheap motels, ate at greasy spoon diners, and felt more free and alive than we had in years. We sent Jessica postcards along the way, and she would text us pictures of the new tomato plants she was trying to grow in a pot on her tiny apartment balcony. On Christmas Eve, a little over a year after that disastrous, life-altering wedding day, Jessica came over for a quiet dinner. As she was helping me with the dishes in the kitchen, she turned to me, her expression serious and thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about why I did what I did," she said quietly, carefully drying a serving platter. "And I know I blamed Kevin for a lot of it, and he deserves that blame. But it was me too. I was so insecure, so desperate to be seen as successful and important in his world. I think I was ashamed." She paused and took a deep breath. "I was ashamed of where I came from. Of being ordinary, of having a normal middle-class family." She finally looked at me, her eyes clear and full of a painful honesty. "I was so busy trying to be someone else that I threw away the best part of who I really was. Your daughter." Later that evening, after Jessica had gone home, Tom and I sat by the fireplace, sharing a glass of wine. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet-wrapped box. "I was going to wait until tomorrow," he said softly, "but this feels like the right moment." Inside was a delicate silver charm bracelet. There was only one charm on it, a tiny, intricately detailed butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. "My sister Patty's words stuck with me," he explained, his eyes shining in the firelight. "You've transformed this year, Carol. You found your wings." I clasped it around my wrist, the cool metal a comforting solid weight. I still have my grandmother's pearl necklace. It's tucked safely away in my jewelry box. Someday, maybe years from now, when the time is right, I will give it to her. Not as an obligation or a family tradition, but as a gift freely given between two women who have fought their way through the darkness and have found a new respect for each other on the other side. Our journey has been the hardest, most painful one of our lives, but it taught us a vital, powerful lesson. True love isn't about giving someone everything they want. It's about giving them what they need. And sometimes what they need most is the space to fall so they can finally learn the strength it takes to fly on their own. Boundaries aren't walls you build to push people away. They are the strong foundations you lay to build a healthier, more honest, and ultimately more loving relationship. What about you? Have you ever had to make a difficult, painful choice like this in your own family, setting a boundary that was necessary for your own well-being? Please, share your story and your wisdom in the comments below. Your experiences matter to everyone in this community, and we can all learn from each other. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If it resonated with you in any way, please give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories just like this one.